One here, and are we ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. Plaintiffs are ready to proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. The legislative defendants are ready to proceed.
And so are the state defendants. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Masterman and Ms. Harrison, are you both able to hear me okay? And you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your
Yes,
Honor.
sir.
All right, great. Looks like everyone's here then, and we are ready to go back on the record. Mr. Masterman, you may ask your next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. And hello again, Representative. You can still hear me? Okay.
I can. Thank you.
Great. And so we were just discussing House Bill 1169. You voted for that bill, correct?
I did.
Not every Democrat did, correct?
That's correct.
Do you recall during the floor debate on that bill saying that with one exception, nothing went into this bill that we strongly objected to, but we actually didn't strongly object at the time, so the voter ID provision ended up in the bill?
Your Honor, objection relevant. I believe House Bill 1169 was passed over a year after the events at issue in this case with respect to Senate Bill 824.
Give me just 1 second, please. The objection is sustained.
You believe that adding public assistance IDs would improve access to polls, however, under the SB 824 voter ID law, right?
Yes.
Okay. And I believe you said that improving access to the polls was the ultimate goal of the Democratic caucus meeting that you.
Yes.
I'd now like to show you another of the House amendments that was not passed. This is JX 0632, House Amendment A3. Are you seeing it up on your screen?
I am.
And does this look like an accurate copy of the amendment that you would have seen on the House floor?
Yes.
And this amendment was sponsored by Representative Fisher, is that correct?
That is correct.
And Representative Fisher is a Democrat?
She is.
And this amendment failed, correct? I think we saw that at the top of the page.
Yes.
Are you aware of any other amendment proposed by a Democratic representative in the House that was rejected on the House floor?
You mean besides the Susan Fisher amendment and the Bobby Richardson amendment? The Marsha Mori amendment was ruled out of order. I can't recall. I'm sorry.
And so the just to be clear, the Mori amendment wouldn't have been voted on. So I was asking, which are you aware of any other amendments that the House voted on and rejected before?
I cannot recall any others. Thank you.
Is it your understanding that this amendment would have allowed high school students to present photo IDs issued by their high schools when voting?
That was my recollection and was the purpose of this amendment. Yes.
Would you have voted for Senate Bill 824 if both this amendment and the public assistance ID amendment had been adopted?
Objection, Your Honor. Incomplete hypothetical.
Your Honor, I'm happy to be heard if necessary.
The objection is overruled.
Would you like me to re-ask my question, Representative?
No, excuse me. No, thank you. So I probably wouldn't have voted for the bill if these two had passed because I felt like there was probably more we could do. For instance, the Mori amendments that were ruled out of order, and there was more that we could do to improve the bill.
And we'll come to the Mori amendments in a little while. I just want to discuss this amendment a little bit more with you. Do you know how many high schools in North Carolina issue photo IDs?
I do not know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Do you know whether all of them do?
I don't know the answer to that either.
Do you know what number, and so maybe you wouldn't know this either, but do you know what the percentage of high school IDs out there are issued by public versus private schools?
I do not know the answer to that either. Sorry.
And looking at the text of the underlined text here on the block quote, this amendment would have required, according to the last line, that the card be issued in accordance with GS 163A1145.2, correct?
Yes.
And to your recollection, that's the statutory section that requires the state board to approve certain college IDs. Is that right?
That's my recollection. Yes.
Do you know how many high schools in North Carolina issue IDs that meet those requirements?
I do not. No.
But according to this amendment, the state board would have needed to approve those IDs before they could be used for voting, correct?
That is correct.
They could only be used for voting in a general election if the student were above the age of 18, correct?
That is correct. Yes.
They could be used in a primary election if the student was going to be 18 by the time of the general, correct?
Yes.
Do you know how many high school students in North Carolina are registered voters?
I don't know off the top of my head. I remember seeing the figure before, but I don't know now. I'm sorry.
Do you know how many high school students in North Carolina are registered voters and have a high school ID as their only form of photo ID?
I don't know the answer to that either.
Do you know how many African American high school students in North Carolina are registered voters and have a high school ID as their only form of photo ID?
Sorry, I do not.
So you wouldn't know how many registered voters would have been able to vote under Senate Bill 824 only because of the inclusion of high school IDs, correct?
That is correct.
But under Senate Bill 824, any registered voter who might have only a high school ID could obtain an ID free of charge from a county board of elections. Is that right?
That is right.
And if
Yes.
one of those voters had a reasonable impediment to presenting an ID, they could complete a reasonable impediment form and cast a provisional ballot, correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Senate Bill 824 requires the state board to issue that form, correct?
That is correct.
Senate Bill 824 requires that the form include certain boxes that the voter can check to indicate an impediment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is it your understanding that the boxes that are specifically listed in Senate Bill 824 are the only boxes that the state board can include on that form?
I'm sorry. Could you ask that again? I think I heard it right, but I want to make sure I answer it right.
Sure. So on Senate Bill 824, there are those listed impediments.
Oh, right.
And are those the only ones that the state board can include, or are those just the minimum ones?
No, those are the minimum ones, is my recollection.
Okay. And Senate Bill 824 also requires that the form have a box for other, correct?
That's my recollection. Yes.
Okay. So the state board could include school schedule on the reasonable impediment form, correct?
They could. Yes.
And if a high school voter might not be able to obtain any form of qualifying ID, and if school schedule is not on the form, they could check the box for other and write school schedule, correct?
That's accurate. Yes.
And we were discussing the requirements for college IDs, and Senate Bill 824 does allow voters to present student IDs from a institution within the University of North Carolina system, or a community college, or an eligible post-secondary institution, as long as that ID is approved, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Do you know how many of these college and university IDs the state board has approved for voting use so far?
I'm sorry, I remember seeing a figure back when there was a deadline, but I can't remember off the top of my head what that number is.
Do you remember whether, for example, the state's 10 largest colleges have been approved? IDs from those colleges have been approved yet?
I don't remember which ones have been. I'm sorry.
Have you tried to study how many registered voters who might have only a high school ID would matriculate to a college with an approved voting ID before the first elections in which that voter could vote?
I have not.
Are you aware of any studies like that?
I am not aware off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
And you were discussing on your direct Representative Lewis, who was chairman of the House Select Committee on Elections during the Senate Bill 824 process. Is that correct?
Yes.
And earlier today, you were also discussing the House Election Committee's December 3rd hearing. And I'd like to pull up JX 0774, which is a transcript of that hearing. And so you see this is a transcript of the December 3rd hearing. And Ms. Hardiman, could we go down to transcript page 27? And you see your name there on line 5.
I do.
Okay. And I'm not going to make you read anymore. I just want to focus on a specific statement at the beginning here. You see where, and I'll read it to you. It says, "Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chair Lewis. I agree with Representative Jackson that you all have made a number of improvements, and I appreciate that." And I know that you said that thanking other members of the House is a matter of decorum. I just wanted to ask, when you said that you all have made a number of improvements, were you telling the truth?
Oh, I was.
Okay. Ms. Hartman, could we now pull up JX 0776? And this is a transcript of the December 4 hearing that you were also discussing on direct. And could we go down to transcript page 98? And I just wanted to see if you could recite your entire statement again from memory. I'm just kidding. I just want to look at transcript 98, beginning of your statement here. You said, "Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to thank Chair Lewis and the rest of the committee for working with us as we tried to improve this bill. And I'm looking forward to further improvements, perhaps on the House floor tomorrow." And when you said this, were you telling the truth on December 4th?
I was. Thank you. Yes.
And Ms. Hardiman, could we now pull up JX 0777? This is a transcript that you've seen before for the House floor debate. And Ms. Hardiman, could we go to transcript page 116? And you see your name there, beginning on line 18. And I'll read you again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House. I did want to start by thanking Chairman Lewis because I think he's done a really terrific job working with us to help improve the bill. And then continuing down to the next page. And this bill is a much better bill than the bill that left this chamber in 2013. So I want to thank him for that. When you say a much better bill than the bill that left this chamber in 2013, were you talking about HB 589?
I was. I'm talking about the concurrence vote, not the second and third reading on the House version of 589, because that was a very different bill than the concurrence vote on 2013. Just to be clear, yes.
And when you made this statement, were you telling the truth?
Yes.
Ms. Hardiman, you can take that down. And you've discussed today your concerns that a number of voters would be disenfranchised under Senate Bill 824. And just to be clear, when you use the word disenfranchise, you mean prohibiting otherwise eligible voters from being able to vote, correct?
Yes, I guess that would be a way to describe it.
And you said today and in the 4 statements that you read today that there are a couple of 100,000 North Carolinians who do not currently possess an ID that they could use to vote. Do you still think that number is accurate?
I do. Excuse me. I believe that was based on some state board of elections data. So I do.
That would have been the state board of elections presentation from Ms. Strock that you were discussing on November 26th.
Yes.
Okay. And I also think that you read earlier your statement on the floor that there were 1,000 reasonable impediment ballots that were cast and more than a quarter that were rejected. There you were talking about the March 2016 primary election data. Is that correct?
I was, and I recognize that that's somewhat different from the data that Director Strack presented at the November 26th. But there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. Yes.
When you say discrepancy, I think you said earlier that looking at the Strack, maybe a little over 10% were rejected, and you say here a quarter. That's different, right?
Yes.
Okay. You yourself have not attempted to study the rate at which any group of voters possesses a qualifying ID, correct?
That's correct.
And you yourself have not reviewed the state board's data about reasonable impediment ballots that were rejected in March 2016, have you?
I haven't seen well, I've seen anecdotal data that was posted by some of the advocacy groups, and I think that's where I got my information, and then I saw Director Strack's presentation, but separate from that, I haven't gone in and crunched any numbers, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, that is what I was asking. And you mentioned the anecdotal data. Did you yourself attempt to confirm whether any of those anecdotes were true?
I did not separately verify. I think some of that was filed with various court documents, maybe in previous proceedings, but I didn't. No, I did not myself.
And you yourself didn't attempt to study whether that anecdotal data was somehow representative of the entire North Carolina population, correct?
That's correct. I just had to trust the messengers.
And you said those messengers were advocacy groups. Do you remember which advocacy groups?
Well, I remember seeing some information that was circulated that it looked like maybe Democracy North Carolina, NAACP, ACLU, and a few other groups. were involved in pulling that information together.
Is it safe to say groups that are opposed to voter ID laws?
Yes, restrictive voter ID laws. Yes, groups opposed to restrictive voter ID laws. Yes.
And so you would have seen the Strzok, and I'm sorry, there's a siren going outside my window. I hope you that doesn't disrupt.
It's okay.
You would have seen the Strzok presentation on November 26th at the Joint Election Committee hearing, correct?
Yes.
And you went out of interest. You weren't on the committee, correct?
Right. So the Chair Lewis had invited all the House members, and so I thought it would be wise to go.
And so there were a number of House members in attendance who were not on the committee, correct?
That's correct.
Ms. Hardiman, could we pull up JX 0878? And this is the Strzok presentation that you were reviewing earlier. Can we go down to PDF page 18? The presentation itself does not have page numbers. Okay. Actually, could you go, I think, sorry, Ms. Hardiman, one up here. No, sorry, maybe one down, one moment. There we go. So this is actually PDF 19, I apologize. And I'll read you these two bullets. No match list generated by comparing DMV and voter roll databases to identify voters who could not be matched with a DMV identification card. Final analysis in February of 2015 resulted in a list of 254,391 registrations who could not be matched to a DMV identification card. Is that what you recall learning at that presentation?
Yes.
Okay. And this slide identifies voters who could not be matched specifically to a DMV ID, correct?
That's correct.
Under Senate Bill 824, voters may present more than just DMV IDs, correct?
That's correct.
A voter could present a passport, correct?
Oh, correct. Sorry. Yes.
A voter could present a tribal enrollment card issued by a state or federally recognized tribe, correct?
Yes. Correct.
A voter could present an approved student ID, correct?
That's correct.
A voter could present an approved employee identification card issued by a state or local government entity, correct?
That's correct.
A voter could present a military identification card issued by the U.S. government, correct?
That's correct.
A voter could present a veteran's identification card, correct?
That's correct.
And we discussed the IDs that can be obtained from the county boards of elections. A voter could present one of those, correct?
That's correct.
A voter could also present a driver's license or a non-operator's ID issued by another state's DMV, as long as the voter had registered within 90 days of the election, correct?
That's correct.
None of these forms of ID are captured on this slide of Ms. Strzok's presentation, correct?
That's my understanding. Yes, correct.
So as far as you're aware, this 254,000 number does not account for voters who might have lacked a DMV ID, but possessed one of those other forms of ID, correct?
Yes, correct.
And voters are able to present more forms of ID under Senate Bill 824 than were under House Bill 589, correct?
That's my recollection. Yes.
You don't know how the expansion in the list of approved IDs will impact the percentage of registered voters that might have an acceptable voter ID, correct?
That's correct. We did hear an analysis of that. Yeah.
Scrolling down to the next slide, Ms. Hardiman. And I think, yeah, we're on track now. Okay. The first bullet here indicates that the voter outreach team sent a mailing to each unmatched voter. 20,580 returned a response card. Of the responders, 91% indicated that they possessed acceptable identification. 633 of these voters requested assistance. Voter outreach worked each of these in additional cases open based on calls or email. Is this what you also recall learning at the presentation?
Yes.
Would you disagree that 633 is about 3% of the 20,000 responders?
That's it's about 3%. Yes.
That bullet does not indicate whether any of those 633 responders in fact did not possess a qualifying ID, correct?
That's correct.
Now looking down a few slides, and Ms. Hardiman, I think this should be PDF 30. Oh, I must be wrong. Can you go down one more? Okay. So this is PDF 31. I was off by 1 in my counts. And I'll read this as well. 1,048 voters completed a declaration of reasonable impediment indicating a reasonable impediment prevented them from obtaining acceptable identification. Of these reasonable impediment voters, 864 ultimately counted. And to be clear, this is the 2016 primary data. And is this what you also recall learning at the presentation?
Yes.
And so you did the math earlier. I believe 140.
Bad math.
I believe it's 184. We'll say that's what you said. Correct?
Yeah.
So according to this slide, 184 of these ballots were rejected in the March 2016 primary, correct?
Correct.
You don't believe that the act of casting a provisional ballot constitutes disenfranchisement, correct?
No, I mean, I think there's a little bit more of a burden voting that way, but no.
So the mere fact that it might take additional time to cast a ballot doesn't constitute disenfranchisement in your view?
I'm sorry, Mr. Masterman, you did break up there for me. Can you please repeat your question?
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me now? Okay. The mere fact that it takes some additional time to cast a provisional ballot does not constitute disenfranchisement in your view, correct?
No, I think it's relative, but not necessarily. It depends on the circumstances, I guess. If it's 8 hours of extra time or something, yeah. But on the face of it, not this. But
would you agree that if their vote is counted, they're not disenfranchised?
yes.
And so the 864 voters whose ballots were counted in 2016 were not disenfranchised, correct?
That's correct.
And going down to the next slide, this will be PDF 32. It indicates that 1,248 voters did not present acceptable photo identification or execute a declaration of reasonable impediment or to the county office by the deadline after election night. These votes did not count. You recall learning this at the meeting as well?
I do.
You don't know why any of these voters did not execute a reasonable impediment declaration, do you?
I do not.
You don't know how many of these voters in fact possessed qualifying ID, correct?
I do not.
And just as far as we can tell from this slide, all these voters might have had qualifying ID, but simply failed to return to the county board to cure their ballots in time, correct?
Objection, speculation.
Give me just 1 second. Can you repeat that question, please?
Yes. I asked, as far as we can tell from this slide, all these voters might have had a qualifying ID, but simply failed to return to the county board to cure their ballots in time.
The objection's overruled. You may answer the question.
That's correct.
And you also don't know whether any of the voters represented on this slide had any form of ID that didn't qualify for voting use under House Bill 589, but that does qualify for voting use under Senate Bill 824, correct?
Yeah, I guess that's correct. Yes.
And finally, let me just draw your attention to the title of this slide. And can you see it there? It's titled Implementation. Is it fair?
Yeah.
That okay. Is it fair to say that your concerns about the potential impact of Senate Bill 824 have to do with your concerns about how its provisions will be implemented?
Yes. Yes.
And you don't know why any of the 184 reasonable impediment ballots that were not counted, you don't know why they weren't counted in the 2016 primary, correct?
I do not. I saw, again, I saw some testimonials that had been printed up about individuals who forms were rejected because they weren't able to use class schedule as a impediment, and a few other instances. So I can't say that I know precisely why all 184, but I did see some testimonial about why some were rejected. Somebody had a, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. No, you please finish your answer.
Well, I was just going to say, I remember seeing someone who had an expired passport but didn't have his driver's license. I saw a variety of folks whose reasonable impediment documents were rejected for various reasons, but I don't know all 184. I'm sorry.
These were from your anecdotal evidence.
Yes.
Ms. Harding, can we scroll back up one? Ms. Strock's slide doesn't say why any of the reasonable impediment forms were rejected, does it?
No.
Whatever the reason, the law that would have been in place for the March 2016 primary, that would have been House Bill 589, correct?
Yes.
As originally passed, House Bill 589 didn't have a impediment exception, correct?
Right. That was added with the later bill.
You voted for that bill that added that exception, correct?
I guess I did. I can't remember which bill it was, but I guess I did.
This House Bill 836 ring a bell?
Okay.
Have you studied the differences between the reasonable impediment provisions of House Bill 589 as amended and the reasonable impediment provisions of Senate Bill 824?
Have I studied those? No, I have not.
Okay. Have you studied whether any of the 184 reasonable impediment ballots rejected under House Bill 589 in March 2016 would be accepted under Senate Bill 824?
I have not studied that. No.
And you would agree that Bill 824 on its face requires that a voter without an acceptable form of ID be offered a reasonable impediment form, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding. Yes.
And you would also agree that the law on its face requires that the ballot shall be counted unless the County Board of Elections has grounds to believe that the reasonable impediment declaration is false, correct?
That's my recollection. Yes.
Okay. So for that high school student we were discussing, if that student had checked the other box on the declaration form and wrote school schedule, that reasonable impediment ballot could be rejected only if the county boards had grounds to believe that it was false, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
And Ms. Hardiman, we can take this exhibit down. I'm sorry if it was going gray for you as well, Representative Harrison. There seemed to be some issue. You represent Guilford County, I think you said?
I do, yes.
Do you know how many ballots were cast in Guilford County in the March 2016 primary?
Off the top of my head, I do not. I'm sorry.
Do you know how many of those ballots were cast through the reasonable impediment process?
I do not.
Do you know how many ballots cast through that process in Guilford County were rejected?
I do not.
And so you wouldn't know why any of them might have been rejected, correct?
That's accurate, yes.
Have you requested any of that information from the State Board of Elections?
I have not. I have not.
Are you aware of any rules proposed by the State Board of Elections under Senate Bill 824 requiring the county boards of elections unanimously decide that a reasonable impediment declaration is false before rejecting that ballot?
No, I'm not aware. No, I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware whether any similar regulation was promulgated under House Bill 589?
I'm not aware of that. No.
You mentioned on your direct examination your amendment about requiring unanimous votes on challenges. Do you recall that?
I do. Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, is that the amendment that you proposed in the elections committee that I think Chairman Lewis withdrew his motion to vote the bill out so that you could present that amendment?
Yes, I'm trying to remember the process there, but I do believe that's when it happened. Yes.
Yes. And why was ensuring unanimity important to you there?
My recollection was that that meant that one of the judges could have a challenge, could reject a ballot, and it seemed important that all three agree.
So requiring all of them to agree would be more protective of the voters' rights, correct?
That's accurate, yes.
County boards of elections are bipartisan, is that correct?
That is correct.
Earlier, we were discussing, I think we might have mentioned this 2 times, the voter IDs that can be obtained at county boards of elections. Voters do not need to bring any documents with them when they go to a county board to obtain one of those IDs, correct?
I'm sorry, there was a word that got missed. Voters do not need to bring, and then I did not hear what you said.
Any documents with them. Would you like me to re-ask? Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, I heard. That's my recollection.
And these IDs are available during the one-stop early voting period, correct?
That's true. Yes.
And counties are now required by law to provide for one-stop early voting on the Saturday before an election, correct?
That's correct.
And I think you said earlier that the Saturday before an election day has traditionally been the highest turnout day, correct?
Yes, that's my recollection. Yes.
Are you aware whether the number of one-stop voting sites in Guilford County has increased between the 2012 general election and the 2020 general election?
Yes, that's my recollection, that we have had more sites, definitely.
Guilford is one of the most populous counties in North Carolina, correct?
That's correct.
It has one of the largest African American populations in North Carolina, is that right?
It does, yes.
The Guilford County Board of Elections has offices in Greensboro and High Point, is that right?
Yes,
Greensboro has a bus system, right?
yes,
With lines out to the surrounding areas, I believe.
yes,
High Point also has a public transit system, correct?
yes, it does.
Are you aware whether Guilford County has a van service that elderly, disabled, or low-income residents could use to reach a county board of elections?
Yes, I believe so. I believe I've seen it. Yes.
Does the Guilford County Transportation and Mobility Services, does that ring a bell?
Yes, yes.
Now I want to shift to what you were testifying earlier about the normal legislative processes in the General Assembly. And you were discussing the procedures for placing the voter ID amendment on the ballot, which I think you said seemed inadequate to you, correct?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that your testimony is based on your experience as a member of the General Assembly?
Yes.
You've never served in the North Carolina Senate, have you?
I have not. No.
So you can't speak from experience about the Senate's normal procedures, can you?
I cannot.
And you were sworn in, I believe you said, to the House in 2005.
I was.
So your personal experience as a legislator started in 2005.
It did. Yes. My experience there. Yes. As a member. Yes.
Now, one thing I think you said you found unusual about the voter ID amendment process was the number of other amendments that were placed on the ballot at the same time. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think you said that the General Assembly placed 6 constitutional amendments on the ballot.
Yes.
You can't speak from experience to the average number of constitutional amendments that the General Assembly placed on the ballot in years before 2005, right?
I cannot. I can see the history of it, but I can't speak to my personal experience. Yes.
Do you know how many times the General Assembly has put 5 or more amendments to the current Constitution on the ballot at the same time?
I may have been once or twice. I can't recall. Back maybe in the 90s and before. But I can't remember specifically.
So you can't remember, just to be clear, based on what you might have reviewed before, you can't remember specific number of times that might have happened.
That's accurate. Yes.
Another thing that you mentioned being unusual about the House Bill 1090 process, the voter ID, was, I think, the amount of debate it received in the House, correct?
Correct.
You've not gone back and looked to see how many hours of legislative debate were done in prior years where there might have been more than one constitutional amendment on the ballot, correct?
That's accurate. Yes.
And you're also not comfortable saying that the process that the 6 constitutional amendments, including the voter ID amendment, went through was an illegal process, are you?
Oh, no. No, I'm not.
You're not aware that it deviated from any rules or requirements of the General Assembly?
Off the top of my head, I'm not aware specifically. There might have been a procedural rule, but I can't remember.
So you're, at this point, you can't testify that there were any rules or requirements that were violated in that process.
That's correct. Yeah.
From your perspective, all of the constitutional amendments proposed in 2018 were significant, correct?
From my perspective, yes. Yes.
And the General Assembly passed them all in the same week in June of 2018, correct?
That's my recollection, yes.
So is it fair to say that the amendments received roughly the same amount of consideration by the House?
I didn't, yeah, I guess that's accurate. Yeah, I didn't study the hours that were spent on all the other 5, but my recollection, that's my recollection.
So you haven't compared the amount of time spent considering HB 1092 to the other 5 amendments. Is that right?
That's right.
Some of the other amendments had strong Democratic support in the House, correct?
That is accurate, yes.
For example, the Strengthening Victims' Rights Amendment, that's commonly known as the Marsy's Law Amendment, that had both a significant number of Republican and Democratic votes, correct?
It did, yes.
And I think you said earlier you didn't vote for any 6 of the amendments to place them on the ballot, correct?
That's accurate.
You thought that some of these proposals could have been done through the legislative process rather than.
Yeah, I felt pretty strongly that most of it should have been legislation and not constitutional amendments. They're very difficult to undo or amend a constitutional amendment.
But fair to say that at least for the voter ID amendment, the General Assembly decided to ask the public's.
Sorry, Mr. Masterman, you've broken up there. Can you please repeat it?
I'm sorry. Am I too quiet, or am I just cutting in and out?
You're cutting in and out, and your voice trails off.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I'm trying. Can you hear me, Representative?
I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Well, that's important. So I was just asking for the voter ID amendment. The General Assembly ultimately decided to put the question to the voters of North Carolina first, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, let's jump ahead a few months to when the General Assembly was considering Senate Bill 824. You testified that process seemed rushed to you, correct?
Yes.
You have not looked at any other pieces of legislation to confirm that the process for Senate Bill 824 in fact deviated from the norm, correct?
That's correct. I'm just sort of based on my personal experience. Yes.
So based on your personal experience, not based on a review of the legislative history of any other bills. Is that right?
That's accurate. Yes.
So you have not, for example, studied how much time was allocated for public comment on other bills, correct?
No, I have not.
And you have not studied how much time for floor debate was allocated for any other bills, correct?
I have not.
Do you know approximately how many total hours of debate Senate Bill 824 received on the House floor and in House committees?
I recall it was about close to 2.5 hours on the floor, but I can't recall with the House committees how much total that was.
Do you know what the total was in the House and Senate combined?
I do not.
And as we discussed, Senate Bill 824 had primary sponsors from both parties, correct?
That's accurate.
Do you know what the average time is for a Democratic Republican co-sponsored bill to go through the legislative process?
I do not, but yeah, I do not.
Do you recall specifically whether when Democrats have had control of the General Assembly, any bills were passed in the same amount of time as Senate Bill 824?
Um, I don't.
So you can't say one or the other, whether they were or not.
I cannot say one way or the other.
During your career in the General Assembly, has a party with a supermajority ever lost that majority while the governorship was held by someone in the opposite party?
Yeah, no, I cannot say.
So is 2018 the only time you remember?
It's the only time I remember, but I'm trying to think back. But yeah, I think that's all I can remember. Yeah.
And you believe that the desire of the majority to get Senate Bill 824 passed during the time frame that it did was so that they could have the majority to override the veto of Governor Cooper, who had made clear that he was not a supporter of voter ID, correct?
That was a lot of our assumption. Yeah.
You do not attribute any other intention to the General Assembly for pushing Senate Bill 824 through during the November session, correct?
That's correct.
And you testified earlier, we were discussing the Maury amendments. Those were ruled out of order, I believe. The House rules require that amendments be germane to the measure under consideration, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
The measure under consideration in this case was legislation to implement the constitutional voter ID amendment, correct?
That's correct.
And I think you said earlier that the Maury amendments concerned early voting options and hours, correct?
Well, it did, but the early voting sites were where folks could get their voter IDs issued. So we all thought it was very germane.
So is it that you disagreed with the speaker's ruling in that case?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
But,
yes.
But the speaker followed normal procedures when he ruled those amendments out of order, correct?
Well, I guess you could say he did, but we disagreed with that, his interpretation of what germaneness meant. So that, yes.
Representative Maury was permitted to appeal his ruling, correct?
She was.
And the House as a whole voted on whether to sustain her appeal, correct?
Yes.
And offering amendments and having them ruled out of order, that happens frequently, correct?
It does, particularly on controversial legislation or controversial amendments, perceived controversial amendments.
You also testified earlier about an amendment that would have allowed a voter to cure a provisional ballot at the polling place by receiving the signature from two witnesses to attest to that voter's identity. That was the amendment, I think, that was passed in committee, but later stricken, correct?
Yes, Representative Jackson's amendment, yes.
Under Senate Bill 824, voters without ID can still cast a provisional ballot by completing a reasonable impediment declaration, correct?
That's my recollection. I believe it just would require another trip to the Board of Elections to cure it, is what I recall, but yes.
Oh, sorry, we're talking about two different voting process. I think you were talking about the people who can go back and cure before canvass. I was just asking someone who shows up without an ID and has a reasonable impediment to presenting ID can cast a reasonable impediment ballot, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the reasonable impediment form doesn't require the voter to obtain two witnesses' signatures, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. You also testified earlier that your objection to proceeding with the third reading was ruled out of time. has happened before, correct?
Yes, it has. It's not too common, but it has, yeah.
It's also happened under Democratic control of the General Assembly, specifically the House, correct?
And I recall this coming, I believe I recall this coming up during the deposition, but I'm fairly certain it didn't happen under Speaker Hackney, but it might have happened before his tenure.
Correct. I think you, at your deposition, you gave the example of a Senate vote on the lottery. Did that happen?
And that did, and you were talking about the House chamber, but I think that I recall that the Senate, that Lieutenant Governor Perdue at the time ignored an objection to third, if I recall correctly, on the lottery vote.
And yeah, sorry for the mix-up on House, Senate. But that didn't violate any rules or requirements of the General Assembly in this case, correct?
I think ignoring an objection to third does violate the Senate rules, but ignoring an objection to third does violate the Senate rules, but I'm not an expert on the Senate rules.
What about the House rules?
Ignoring an objection of third, it seems like it's in violation of the House rules. We're not in charge of the chamber.
Okay.
I'm
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Can you think of a specific rule that you're thinking of?
I'm sorry, I don't have them all memorized. I constantly have to check my book, and I don't have any notes with me. So,
I think you mentioned the technical corrections process. Additional amendments were proposed during that process, correct?
that's correct, because we did not have a chance on third reading to offer our amendments.
Were there any amendments that you didn't offer in technical correction that the Democratic caucus wanted to offer?
I don't remember any.
You also testified earlier about public commenting options in the House hearings. And I think you were talking about there not being public comment at the December 3rd Elections Committee hearing, but there was some public comment at the December 4 committee hearing. Is that what you testified?
I did. I do think people came expecting to testify on the 3rd, but there was not time, if I recall correctly, so it was moved to the 4th. But I believe some of those people couldn't make it back. But there were a handful of public commenters on December 4th.
Okay. And you also testified about public comment at the Joint Elections Committee, which you mentioned, I think, being limited to 30 spots. Again, you were not on that committee, correct?
That's correct, but I was there for the entirety of the committee meeting. Yes.
But you were not involved in organizing the public comment opportunities for that meeting, correct?
That's accurate. Yes.
Do you recall whether Chairman Lewis said at that meeting that the committee had limited public comment to 30 people, or that only 30 people had signed up?
I can't recall.
Okay. Did you listen to all 30 of those statements?
I did.
How many of those statements simply argued that voter ID is a good or a bad policy?
Well, it was a while ago. I did review the transcript, but I can't remember. It seemed like a lot of them argued one way or the other regarding the merits of voter ID.
How many of those statements argued that the General Assembly should make Senate Bill 824 more restrictive, such as by approving fewer IDs or getting rid of the reasonable impediment process?
Well, I don't know the number, but I do remember folks advocating for a very restrictive ID. Even I remember somebody saying that everybody should be required to have a real ID to vote. So there were a few in there that were arguing for a more restrictive voter ID. Yes.
And that's not what the General Assembly ended up passing. Is that right?
That's accurate, yes.
The committee also accepted written submissions from members of the public, correct?
And I can't speak to that because, well, yes, I guess we received, I only saw one written comment from someone who had more to say than the 2 minutes allowed, but I can't speak to that, I'm afraid.
So you didn't read, you wouldn't have read all of the written submissions that the joint committee had submitted to it. Is that right?
That's right, because I don't believe they were distributed to the rest of us who weren't members of the committee.
Did you request them?
I may not have been aware that they existed.
And just to be clear, this was the hearing that occurred the day before Senate Bill 824 was formally introduced, correct?
That's accurate. I mean, I believe I asked about it if there were going to be an online comment portal, but I'm not quite sure that was ever set up. So I was not aware what other comments were out there. Yes, for the November 26th meeting.
Okay. And in addition to the public commenters, the joint committee, I think you said, heard from some invited speakers. We talked about Ms. Strock, and there were also representatives from private colleges and community colleges, correct?
And that's accurate, yes.
Do you know how much public comment the Senate received on the bill?
I do not. I don't know anything about this Senate process, really.
So you didn't review the public comments received in the Senate?
I did not.
You testified a few times on direct about not receiving more recent data. While Senate Bill 824 was under consideration, you did not seek information directly from the State Board of Elections about how the implementation of House Bill 589 went in the 2016 primary election, did you?
I don't believe I did.
Did you request any information from the State Board of Elections?
I cannot recall that I did. I'm sorry, I cannot recall if I did.
So you can't testify that you did request that information, correct?
I cannot testify that I did, yes.
You also read from your floor statement where you said that you believed voters were confused about what the voter ID amendment would require when it's on the ballot, correct?
Yes.
You believe that people who voted for it may not have understood the potential for disenfranchising voters, and you believe that people who voted against it did understand that, correct?
Yes.
So in other words, people who voted for the amendment may not have understood it, but those who voted against it did.
I think what I was trying to convey was that people who voted against it, my perception is that people who voted against it understood that there were a lot of voters who might not be able to access the kind of IDs that they would need to vote, and that would impose an impediment on voting. And the people who voted for it saw voter ID identification requirement language in the voter ID proposed amendment, and may have thought that, as I said earlier, your YMCA card would work, or your bank card, because it had your picture on it. And this was about making sure you were who you said you were. And so I think that that was my perception. And yeah, that was my perception.
So let's talk about your bases for that perception. You don't have a specific number of voters who might have been confused about the amendment, correct?
I do not have a specific number. That's accurate.
And so your belief is based, I think you said, on some conversations with some voters. Is that correct?
Yes, at the polls and maybe even communications with constituents via email, but yeah.
You did not conduct or see any polls related to whether voters understood the constitutional amendment, correct? The voter ID amendment, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
And you did not personally send out any kind of survey?
I did not send out a survey, no. Any kind of survey.
And so because you didn't conduct any sort of survey, you can't state with certainty what reasons people had or what they understood when they voted on the amendment, correct?
I guess that would be correct, yes.
Would you agree that voters largely understood that what was being required was that some form of ID was going to have to be presented when they came to vote?
Yes, recall that the description and that accompanied that there would be exceptions, that there would be potential for exceptions, but those weren't spelled out.
Okay, you're talking about the description. Is that the explanation published by the Constitutional Amendment Publications Committee?
Yes.
And that committee published an official explanation of the amendment before voters saw that amendment on the ballot, correct?
That's correct.
And to your knowledge, that explanation was available online, is that right?
That's my recollection, yes. Excuse me.
You don't know how many people might have seen that explanation, do you?
I have no idea.
To your recollection, did you believe that the language on that explanation was misleading about what the amendment would be accomplishing or what the General Assembly's duties would be?
To my recollection, no. But I don't recall it being misleading.
And you also, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
You didn't. I'm sorry.
You also can't state with certainty that enough voters didn't fully appreciate what they were voting on to have changed the outcome of the vote on the voter ID amendment, can you?
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat that, please.
Sure, yeah. And I was just asking, you can't say with certainty that enough voters didn't understand what they were voting on to have changed the outcome of that vote, correct?
That's correct. I just wanted to make sure I heard you right. Yes.
Do you know how many times the General Assembly has proposed an amendment to the current Constitution that requires implementing legislation and passed that implementing legislation in the same session?
I do not, but I mean, I believe the Marcy's Law included the legislation. I believe the hunting and fishing, but I can't recall exactly.
Okay. In cases where the General Assembly has passed implementing legislation at the same time as a proposed amendment, does the language of the implementing legislation itself go on the ballot?
It would not necessarily.
And you mentioned the Marcy's Law amendment. So it's your testimony that the General Assembly passed implementing legislation at the same time?
That's my recollection.
Okay.
I'm sorry. This is 2 years ago, and it's really hard to remember it all. So I apologize if I sound a little fuzzy, but I remember seeing pretty specific legislation related to the Marcy's Law constitutional amendment. And I can't remember which of it was actually in the amendment versus implementing legislation. So I apologize.
No, perfectly fine. Can you recall whether you saw that legislation in the 2018 session when you were considering the proposed amendment, or whether you saw it in the new General Assembly after the amendment had been passed.
Oh, I remember seeing some pretty specific legislation related to Marcy's Law. But I do recall that there was additional implementation legislation, if I remember correctly, that was enacted post 2018 election.
And
But I'm really not. I didn't really focus on that or review that in advance of this, so I may be off a bit. So I apologize.
understood. And only one other question on Marcy's Law. Do you recall whether the language that voters would have seen on the ballot indicated that the General Assembly was going to pass legislation?
I don't recall. I'm sorry.
Do you recall any efforts made in the General Assembly to clarify the language of the voter ID amendment that would go on the ballot?
I'm sorry. Are you talking about amending House Bill 1092 or?
I'm talking about the language that House Bill 1092 put on the ballot for voters to see. Are you aware of any efforts to clarify that language either before or after 1092 is passed?
I mean, there were efforts to amend 1092, but subsequent to that, I don't recall. I believe we adjourned pretty shortly after those amendments were passed to reconvene in November. So I think we're out of session, but I don't recall.
After the General Assembly passed those 6 amendments, do you recall reconvening to rewrite 2 of the amendments' ballot language, specifically for the judicial vacancies and the State Board of Elections appointments amendments?
My memory is fuzzy on that, and I really can't speak to that. I'm sorry.
But you don't recall reconvening to rewrite the voter ID amendment, correct?
I do not. No.
I think we said this at the beginning. Notwithstanding that you think some voters might have been confused, you would agree that once the amendment part of the Constitution, the General Assembly has to respect the voters' decision, correct?
Yes, that's true. Yes.
Would you say that you are committed to fair elections?
I am.
Would you say, as someone committed to fair elections, that ensuring that only individuals who are actually eligible to vote are allowed to vote is an important goal?
Yes, it is.
Would you also agree that ensuring voters' confidence in the integrity of elections is an important goal?
Yes, but I'd say it's getting increasingly hard to get that confidence in elections.
But you acknowledge that there are voters out there who feel like there might be voter impersonation, correct?
There might be, but there are also voters who think the November election was stolen. I'm not sure you can use that as a pretext for enacting voter restrictive legislation, I guess.
Yeah, my own question is whether you recognize that there are voters out there who might feel that voter impersonation exists.
I believe there might be people out there who believe voter impersonation exists.
And who could support voter ID laws for that reason.
And who could, yes.
Now, Ms. Hardiman, could we pull up what the demonstrative that was shown on the direct examination, EDS 1-14? Do you recall seeing this chart during your exam?
Yes.
Before you get any further into that, let me just stop you right there, if that's okay. It's 12:30. It's time for our lunch break. We're going to take a lunch recess at this point. Are there any matters that we need to take up? I see
Yeah.
Ms. Riggs.
Your Honor, Allison Riggs for the plaintiffs. One issue we'd like to raise pursuant to this court's ruling that we be allowed to call Mr. Ford in our case in chief. He's our second witness on our list today. We were hoping to finish his testimony because Legislative Defendants Counsel represented to us that he's not available again until Friday, which would then obviously make it impossible for us to call him in our case in chief. So we moved witnesses around to accommodate his schedule and call him today. Could we get some insight from legislative defendants on how much longer the cross of Representative Harrison is likely to extend, given Mr. Masterman's been going over an hour and a half and has used only 8 of the 63 cross exhibits? We're concerned we won't be able to call Mr. Ford as planned today.
I'm happy to answer, Your Honor.
Okay.
I can represent to you that I have about 2 pages left of questions. I will not be dropping 50 exhibits on Representative Harrison.
How much time approximately does 2 pages of questions represent?
I would predict about 5, Your Honor.
You break up a little bit there. Say that again.
I would predict about 5 minutes, Your Honor, of course, depending on how the interaction goes, but that's what I would say.
Okay. I'll tell you, Mr. Masterman, you may not realize this, but I don't know whether it's your microphone. I'm able to hear Representative Harrison very, very clearly, but I'm not able to hear you very clearly. And it's as if your microphone is too far away from where you're speaking. And so I don't know if you have the ability to use maybe some ear pods with a microphone in them or some other mechanism. But I think that's probably the reason maybe the court reporter has had some issues in hearing you, is because it's almost just like it's grainy, the audio grainy a little bit or choppy. And it's similar to something that you would hear when you are too far away from the microphone or you just have a poor microphone. I don't know. I just bring that up just so you'll know.
I'm sorry about that, Your Honor. I've heard the same thing from my team, and I was trying to lean in as much as possible without looking strange on the camera. I can put on the AirPods. I've had an issue with those as well, but you can let me know if those are come through more clearly.
Okay. Well, we can take it up at 2 and we'll see if that'll work. All right. Anything else before we recess at 2 until 2?
Not for the legislative defendants, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay, we'll be in recess till 2 p.m. Hope you all have a good lunch. We'll see you back here then.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.